So in this final video for our industrialization unit, we look at the efforts of the federal government to maybe limit the largest capitalists of the time, but we see that ultimately it's not going to come to fruition. So in response to what was perceived as the unfair advantage of large trusts, Ohio Senator John Sherman, who is the brother of General William Tecumseh Sherman, introduced a new bill in December 1889 that became known as the Sherman Anti-Trust Act. When William Howard Taft oversaw the final breakup of Standard Oil, so this is over 2 decades after the act is introduced, when Taft does this, he claimed that Rockefeller's business was the primary reason for the bill's existence. Now, the irony with John Sherman of Ohio introducing this bill is that he was identified as a politician that Rockefeller needed on his side, which is appropriate given that Standard Oil's main branch is in Cleveland, Ohio. So Rockefeller sent a check for $600 to Sherman's campaign. Now, Sherman did prove to be a bit of a disappointment with his bill, which Rockefeller publicly declared to be of a very radical and destructive character. President Harrison signed it into law on July 2nd, 1890, and by the letter of this law, any trust, combination, or contract that hindered trade was outlawed. Anyone who violated this was subject to a $5,000 fine, a year in prison, or perhaps both. So on the surface, does seem like maybe it's trying to make an effort to stamp out these trusts. During debate over the bill, labor advocates worried that the language could be interpreted and used against organized labor. Sherman assured them that when workers united for the purpose of their own interests and to try and get pay increases, they would not be affected by the bill and wouldn't be in the final wording of it. Right away, corporate lawyers began crafting legislation that would go after unions. And the bill actually had so many loopholes that it was nicknamed the Swiss Cheese Act. Enforcement was inconsistent, and the law led to an increase in holding companies in an effort to divert attention from the law. Oddly enough, and the biggest twist of all, Rockefeller still believes Sherman to be one of his best allies in Congress after this bill. So he supported his re-election campaign 1 year later. So the legal efforts to try and limit the power of big business ultimately won't come to much. And this is really exemplified by 2 incidents in the first half of the 1890s that illustrate this point. Now remember that labor unions began to focus more intently on organizing skilled workers. And when we look at the steel industry, the main union for steel workers had about 25,000 members, concentrated from the mills outside of Pittsburgh. By the late 1880s, Carnegie had streamlined production at these plants to make it much more efficient, but it came at the expense of the workers because the changes allowed for the hiring of non-union, unskilled workers. By summer 1892, the previous 3-year contract was up, and the company offered workers at the Homestead steel plant a sliding scale that was actually consistent with the previous contract. Carnegie sensed that there was going to be some disputes, so he took a vacation to Scotland and left his partner, Henry Clay Frick, in charge of negotiating the deal. Frick was notoriously anti-union, and he even barricaded the plant with steel gates, barbed wire, and rifle slits for defense in preparation for action. The deadline came and went. The June 30th deadline passed without an agreement. Passed without an agreement. So Frick locked out the union employees until a deal could be reached. And a lockout is when management prevents employees from taking their positions. He even hired agents from the Pinkerton Detective Agency to protect the plant. And this was a tactic often used by management. They would hire Pinkertons for protection and as strikebreakers. Meanwhile, the union steelworkers watched the plant around the clock to ensure that strikebreakers, whom they nicknamed scabs, didn't infiltrate the plant. Now, 2 barges of Pinkertons tried to enter the Homestead steelworks, but workers heard of this and prepared to resist. Gunfire broke out between the 2 sides when the Pinkertons tried to depart, and despite further bloodshed, they eventually withdrew to Pittsburgh by train. Any sympathy that the strikers had simply eroded 2 weeks later when an anarchist named Alexander Berkman entered Frick's office, shot him twice, and stabbed him 3 times. Frick survived, and he was even portrayed as a beleaguered family man, when this, coupled with the death of his newborn son a few days later, was made public. The Pennsylvania governor sent in the militia to restore order, and the strike was broken by November. The Union was gone, and the capitalists had used force to protect their interests and property. The strike leaders and main Union agitators were blacklisted from Carnegie's mills, and the steel industry in general. This means they weren't allowed to work in the industry when they're blacklisted. Carnegie never really forgave Frick for how he handled the strike, and the 2 weren't exactly friends in the first place, so they eventually part ways. So the Homestead strike is the first instance where it's clear that violent confrontation will occur. 2 years later, another one broke out within the city of Pullman, Illinois, and Pullman was the focal point. This was the home of the Pullman Palace Car Company. And the company, as you can see on screen, the company built a planned city for the workers. They had nice houses and yards, they had large public squares, and were generally healthier than the rest of the nation. However, the company owned the entire town, and following the panic of 1893, luxury passenger cars, which the company made, were not in high demand. Owner George Pullman cut wages and laid off employees, but he also kept charging the same rents as before, and that's what led to problems and a strike. The American Railroad Union had proposed unionizing the entire railway industry, and they stepped in to help with the efforts. In the second month of the strike, the ARU voted to not allow any of its workers to handle Pullman cars, so most railway traffic west of Detroit was shut down. At its peak, the Pullman strike included 250,000 workers in 27 states. But the Attorney General of the U.S. actually was a railroad lawyer on the side, and he cited the need for the railroads to run on the condition that mail needed to be delivered. And a federal judge in Milwaukee even declared that a strike is essentially a conspiracy to extort by violence. And this was 1 month before the Pullman strike began, so the courts are going to be siding with the business owners. Riots in Chicago led to violence in other Midwest and Western cities, and federal troops were sent in to prevent strikers from halting the trains. The leaders of the strike were eventually arrested and the movement fell apart. Once again, capital used force to protect property, but this time, the fact that the Sherman Act is used against labor meant that the intervention of the federal government proved to be the decisive factor.